gene editing as a technology is important for Africa because it guarantees food security using minimum resources and maximizing the outputs. Food security has been an issue that the continent has grappled with, and for one thing we know a concern of policymakers, a concern of farmers, and a concern of scientists is how do we feed our populations.
I think genome editing is like a key technology for food self-sufficiency in Africa and beyond, because you can apply genome editing technology to agriculture, industry, environment, and also health sector. But for Africa as a continent, we need to be self-sufficient for in food. So the genome editing technology has a great application in terms of improving the productivity of the crops we have in Africa.
There's different categories of genome editing. In one's end of the spectrum, you have genome edited products that resemble their natural developed or natural evolving counterparts. In this case, there is no insertion and there is absolutely no gene that has been introduced, or there is no additional genetic material introduced into that crop variety. In some cases, you have insertion of gene sequences, and in that case, this would require and would warrant different regulatory processes. And that is why there's different ways and methods that genome-edited products have been regulated.
Actually, when technologies come, we see that those technologies are bypassing Africa. From now onwards, we cannot afford that. The technology, we have to use those technologies, actually. When you use those technologies, the regulatory, of course we need regulatory system, but these regulatories or guidelines or directives should not be an obstacle, or they should not be obstacles for technology development as well as for technology adoption. So far, we have experience, for example, in the case of GMO, where some countries actually copied regulations from Europe, or they became resistant against the technology. Actually, we have faced a lot of problems and obstacles to develop the technology as well as to adopt the technology. Because Africa is Africa, not Europe. When Europe says no, Africa should not follow and say no, because Africa's problem is completely different from that of European problem.
For example, we don't have striga in Europe. Drought is not a problem in most parts of the world. And most pathogens of crops are really mostly in Africa. And Africa is one of the regions in the world that continues to register a very low food production and really food insecurity.
If we take Europe, they are actually food secured, and even they produce surplus. But if we take Africa, we are not food secured. Millions of people are suffering from malnutrition and hunger. Therefore, those technologies should be taken. We have to develop those technologies, we have to use those technologies, but the regulation, the guidelines, or the directives should be enabling directives or regulations. They must be enabling, facilitating. So the regulation must keep the balance. The regulation should not be restrictive.
So one of the problems in Africa in particular is faking of things. And unless they have regulations where people cannot come and present things that are not really from genome editing, those are the type of regulation that must come in place to protect the genuine genome-edited products that we may have. Faking is something that will have to be regulated, and also to ensure that those who are claiming to be doing it are the proper people with the experience and technology to achieve the editing.
If you see the regulatory landscape in genome editing technologies in Africa, there is no one fit to all. Every African country has its own context. Therefore, there is no really one genome editing regulatory framework that can be adopted by all African countries. I think from the presentations that we have heard this morning and also in the afternoon, I think regulatory frameworks on genome editing has to be left at the discretion of every country. Yes, of course, when it comes to Ethiopia, we are now almost on the process of drafting, the first genome editing guideline. And of course, we are expecting really to follow also the school of thought that a case-by-case scenario has to be seen if we are going to regulate any genome editing technology.
From the technical background and knowledge that I have, it's not a technology that requires, definitely not a technology that requires as rigorous regulation as other technologies that we've had in the past. And therefore, African countries shouldn't take too long. They should be able to develop guidelines, because you still need guidelines just to avoid people misusing, because every technology in some sense can be misused. So you just need simple guidelines to help the scientists chart the way forward.
So for genome editing, the first thing we should do is a proper communication of the technology, and also put in place appropriate regulatory framework to properly handle the technology. And in addition, we need to focus and work on capacity building. I mean, capacity building in terms of researchers, manpower, and of course, infrastructure.
Scientists normally, and especially experts who are in the field, use big words, big scientific jargons that do not tell the story of gene editing. So the first point of call is to unpack those scientific jargons and remove them from the vocabulary. Because if you're communicating, then you need to communicate to people who can understand and comprehend what technology you're talking about. But the second thing, despite just unpacking, is to use language that is relatable. Because when you use languages from outside the continent or from industries that are not relevant in our continent, then the misinformation is propagated. So we need to use contextual language. The definition of what cassava looks like would be different if you're explaining to a child who's learned from a different form of education compared to one that has been taught traditionally. So we need to use the right language so that the communication around gene editing technology products is clear, it is understandable, and it is devoid of myths and what are they called, suspicion.